When we think about the powerful figures of the late Roman Empire, we might first think about Majorian, about Leo, about Anthemius, about Theodosius, Julian, Valentinian, and others. Or we might think about the powerful generals of the Roman army such as Arbogast, Stilicho, Aspar, Aetius, or even the inglorious Ricimer. But one figure that is often getting overlooked is one that we might find quite surprising. That person was for about 12 years, from 425 to 437 AD, the de facto regent of the Western Roman Empire, exerting considerable influence and managing the affairs of the state. But that regent of the Western Empire would be entrenched in a huge power struggle between different military commanders, rivaling usurpers, plundering barbarian hordes, in that utterly chaotic but fascinating time when the slow fall of the Western Roman Empire had begun. And that person was a woman. Throughout Roman history, there were some occasions when women took on the role of regent or at least exerted considerable influence over the Roman Empire. As early as the famous wife of the first emperor Augustus, Livia Drusilla, did women at times exert great power indirectly behind the scenes through their influence over their husbands, the emperors. But at times they themselves would hold authority almost equal to the emperor himself, such as the famous wife of Emperor Justinian, the Empress Theodora. At other times, they would even be the sole rulers themselves, such as the Empress Irene of Athens, who ruled from 797 to 802 AD in the Eastern Roman Empire. But in the tumultuous years when the fall of the Western Roman Empire had slowly begun, that fateful 70 to 80 year-long process, there was a woman who was the de facto ruler of that troubled half of the empire, and her name was Galla Placidia. Her exact birth year is not precisely known, but almost certainly in the interval from 388 to 392 AD. She was born as the daughter of the famous Emperor Theodosius, the last Roman emperor to rule over the Eastern and Western Roman Empire for extended periods of time. And since we know that Theodosius was a hardcore Christian emperor who tried to suppress the old pagan religion by ordering many of the ancient temples closed, Galla Placidia accordingly, as you can imagine, got a thorough Christian education. She had very little choice in the matter, and so of course it is pretty clear that as a member of the Theodosian dynasty, she herself would also become a devout Christian. Her brother was the famously incapable Emperor Honorius, Emperor of the Western Empire, and her other brother was Arcadius, the not much better Emperor of the Eastern Empire. After the death of her father in 395, she spent her childhood years in the household of Flavius Stilicho and his wife, Serena, at Mediolanum, for that was in the last years of the 300s the imperial residence of the Western Roman Empire. It is likely that she received a classical education and could therefore read and write and knew a lot about Roman history and the great classical poets, orators and writers of bygone centuries. These must have been quite happy years when everything was still in order in the West. The barbarian invasions were still far away from the Western Roman Empire in those times, and Mediolanum was a prosperous and magnificent city. But that peace would not last. It is said that arrangements were made for her to marry Eucherius, the son of Stilicho, at some point in the early 400s. But when the mighty Magister Militum Stilicho fell from grace with the emperor, who had been manipulated by one of his ministers, and convinced that Stilicho was planning to install his own son as Eastern Roman Emperor, Honorius had Stilicho murdered. Eucherius was also murdered on orders of Honorius, and therefore, of course, the marriage with Placidia was not possible anymore. And if you are like me, a total Rome nerd, or Romaboo as some people like to say, and I think that you are, or else you probably wouldn't be watching this video, then you might be interested in the incredible rings and other Roman accessories which the SPQR Shop is building. And now for Black Friday, you even get 35% off. I repeat, 35% off by using the Maiorianus link, which I posted in the video description and in the pinned comment. 35%, that is absolutely insane. and they even have some cool new products on sale, such as the limited Intaglio Crusader ring, which is limited to only 50 pieces. There's really no better present for yourself or someone you know who might be a Rome fan. So be sure to check out their amazing assortment, especially for Black Friday until the 27th of November. We can assume that Placidia was absolutely not happy with the decisions of her brother, and they would continue to have a very difficult relationship for the rest of their lives. In the following years, after Stilicho's murder, absolute chaos ensued. Galla Placidia was in Rome when the city fell for the first time in 800 years to foreign invaders during the famous sack of Rome in 410 AD. Gone were the happy days in Mediolanum. They must have seemed like a distant and unreal memory by that time. She was captured by the Visigoths and carried off with other captured Romans to Gaul. Ataulf, the brother of Alaric, became king of the Visigoths in 411 after the death of his brother, and he probably must have had an eye on Placidia from the very beginning. In 414 then, he entered an alliance with Honorius against Gallic usurpers because there were really many usurpers in those times against the weak Honorius, and Ataulf received the consent of Honorius to marry Placidia. They married in 414 and even had a son together, the young Theodosius, named after her father. But the child died early, and with it died the possibility of establishing already very early on a Romano-Visigothic lineage. Ataulf was murdered in 415, and so Placidia remained with the Visigoths, who had by then established themselves in Spain. We can only speculate if Placidia actually mourned the death of her husband or if she was relieved. Such things are lost in time, but these would be the things that would be interesting to know. It was only in 417, when the new Magister Militum Constantius III had started campaigning against the Visigoths and other Germanic tribes, that the Visigoths were forced to negotiate a peace treaty and become foederati of Rome. Galla Placidia was returned to Italy in 417, but her brother, the Emperor Honorius, forced her to marry Constantius III, which happened in January 417. 1 year later, their daughter Justa Grata Honoria was born, and another year later, their son Valentinian III. Both these children would prove quite disastrous for the Western Roman Empire, very much in line with the rest of the Theodosian lineage. Placidia, it seems, was the only exception. We don't exactly know a lot about the years between 417 and 421, but presumably she lived with her children at the imperial palace in Ravenna, where her husband Constantius III had now been made co-emperor of the West by Honorius. Unfortunately though, Constantius died already in 421 from a sickness, and soon afterwards relations with her brother degraded very quickly. It is sometimes said that Honorius made some quite strange advances towards her, as if being physically attracted to his own sister. Honorius, the one who had brought all these troubles over her life, first the murder of Stilicho and her to-be husband Eucherius, then her captivity by the Visigoths, and now this, and she fled with Honoria and Valentinian to Constantinople. Honorius died not much later in 423. It is not exactly known what Placidia and her children did in Constantinople, but her nephew Theodosius II was emperor in those days in the east, and she probably enjoyed a few peaceful years in the Eastern Roman capital. But here too, the peace was not to last. After the death of Honorius, one called Ioannis became emperor of the West, but he was not accepted by Theodosius II, and so an army was dispatched against him. It was in that time that Ioannis had chosen Flavius Aetius as Magister Militum, asking him to call his Hunnic foederati for help against the Eastern Roman forces. Aetius thus went and returned with a Hunnic army, but he arrived too late. Ioannis had already been overthrown by the Eastern Roman forces, which is quite sad because Ioannis was actually a good and tolerant emperor, who was even said to have re-allowed open pagan worship in the West. The West probably would have been better off with Ioannis as emperor instead of Valentinian III. It was then that Placidia, now aged around 35, returned to Ravenna with her 2 children, and thus her son Valentinian III would become Western Roman Emperor. But since he was still very young, just 6 years of age, she was now the effective regent of the Western Roman Empire. Unfortunately, this was in a very unstable time. Not only had several Germanic tribes managed to establish themselves as de facto quasi-independent kingdoms within the territory of the Western Roman Empire, but the Western Empire's army was divided between 3 powerful generals, namely Felix, Bonifacius and Aetius. An impossibly complicated situation for Galla Placidia, as it would turn out. According to Procopius, Aetius was plotting to become supreme general of the Western Roman Empire. So he was plotting against Bonifacius, warning him that Placidia was plotting against him, which of course was untrue. So seeking to increase his strength against Aetius, Bonifacius thus made a terrible mistake. He summoned the Vandals in order to make them his foederati. This didn't turn out exactly well for anyone except for the Vandals. We don't of course know if this is true or not, and it might be partially made up by Procopius, but it shows how the Western Roman generals were plotting against each other. We know that eventually Aetius emerged victorious, and both Bonifacius and Felix had died in that senseless conflict that just further weakened the Western Roman Empire, killing tens of thousands of Roman soldiers and even causing the Vandals to invade Africa, which one could actually see as the first real death blow to the Western Roman Empire. Placidia tried her best in that insane power struggle, but she was really in an impossible situation. It was not really possible for a woman to go to battle herself and take command of an army, as this would have been seen as an absolute outrage by most Romans, and so she had to use clever tactics between Bonifacius, Aetius and Felix, and only in the very end did she finally side with Aetius when she had no choice left. In 433, she finally made Aetius Magister Militum of the West. She still continued to be regent until 437, when her son Valentinian III had become old enough to rule on his own. And please consider supporting this channel via Patreon or YouTube membership, because I really need your help in order to be able to continue this work on late Roman history. Without your support, I don't know how much longer I can continue this channel, because as you can imagine, the YouTube algorithm does not exactly push a niche topic such as late Roman history. Thank you very much. We don't know too much about the years from 437 to 450, in which city she resided the most. We know that she always alternated between Rome and Ravenna, but which city she liked more we can only speculate about. However, it seems that she always had strong ties to Rome, always choosing to return there, where she was also very active regarding ecclesiastical matters. She was active in the building and restoration of churches, and sometimes even got active in the election of popes. We can only speculate as to what she must have been thinking when seeing the Temple of Jupiter in Rome, or the other great pagan monuments of the even then still very pagan-looking Eternal City. Judging from her upbringing in the Theodosian family, I can imagine that she did not have a very favorable view of paganism, but then again, I personally don't know of any laws issued by her against paganism, so maybe she was more tolerant than we know. It seems that finally in her later years she was granted some years of peace when she exerted less influence on Roman politics. It was just in her final years that things would take a bad turn again. In 450, Valentinian III ordered his sister Honoria to marry a Roman senator named Bassus Herculanus against her will. Very foolishly, it is said that she sent a letter to Attila the Hun, pleading him for help against this unwanted marriage, even sending him her ring. Attila took this as a marriage proposal, promptly invading the Western Empire and asking for half of the empire as dowry. We don't know if this story is true or has a true core, as so often with stories as these of the late Roman Empire, because many such stories are only from one source that got copied by others, and so it might just have been a myth. But maybe there is some sort of true core behind it. Placidia must have been quite baffled by the move of her daughter, and it is said that as a punishment, Placidia herself had her banished from Rome, or maybe that she was even executed by Valentinian III. We don't know what happened to Honoria. Her traces vanish after 450. In that same year, Valentinian, Placidia and the entire imperial household had moved to Rome to flee from the invading Huns. And so Placidia spent the last months of her troublesome life in the Eternal City, which in 450 would see the last few years of great splendor. Placidia died in 450 at around the age of 60 from natural causes and was not buried, as some think, in the mausoleum of Galla Placidia at Ravenna, but in Rome. The mausoleum of Galla Placidia, in fact, was a chapel dedicated to the Christian martyr Laurentius of Rome. So Placidia in her last months in Rome was at least granted a peaceful time far away from the constant wars and the disasters that kept sweeping over the empire. She did not have to see Rome sacked in 455, as this would have been the second time she would have witnessed firsthand the Eternal City being sacked. And she did not have to see her son murdering Aetius with his own hands and the subsequent murder of her son as revenge for the murder of Aetius. She was at least spared all these brutal events. And so died possibly the most capable of the children of Theodosius. But she was born into an impossible position, into an impossible time, and being a woman in a position of power in those days was certainly very difficult. She could not stop the dissolution of the Western Roman Empire and the civil war between Bonifacius, Felix and Aetius, which would tear the empire apart. It was her brother that had killed Stilicho, not her, allowing Rome to be sacked. It was her son who had killed Aetius, and it was her daughter that had possibly asked Attila for help. So it seems that she was surrounded by family members that were quick to make some very unintelligent decisions. And what could she alone have done to stop it? She probably tried her best, but her family members counteracted her and she found herself entrenched in a huge civil war. And so I think that she deserves to be mentioned among the emperors of the Western Roman Empire, certainly eclipsing her brother and her own son when it came to state affairs. But it was just not enough to save Rome. And please like and subscribe so that you won't miss any future videos on the fascinating era of the late Roman Empire. And please consider supporting my work on Patreon or via a YouTube membership, because the long-term sustainability of this channel really depends on your support. And I would especially like to thank our new Restitutor Orbis member, Killian. Thank you so much, Killian, for supporting this channel in such a generous form. It is thanks to the amazing patrons and YouTube members of this channel that I can continue making videos about the late Roman Empire. And I want to thank each and everyone who is supporting this channel in any form. And if you want to learn more about why the father of Galla Placidia was maybe not my favorite emperor, you can watch the video in the upper right corner. But if you want to learn more about why Placidia's brother Honorius was so incapable, you can watch the other video in the lower right corner. I say thanks again to all friends of Roman history, gratias tibiago and bene valete.